March 4, 1944, somewhere over the frigid skies of central Germany, Captain Benjamin Hartwell gripped the control stick of his P-51 Mustang, his eyes scanning the horizon where a formation of B-17 flying fortresses labored through the thin air at 23,000 feet. The bombers droned onward toward their target deep inside the Third Reich, their contrails writing temporary signatures across the pale morning sky. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hartwell's fuel gauge had just crossed into the red zone, and standing orders were crystal clear. When your tanks hit reserve, you turn back. No exceptions, no heroics. The mathematics of fuel consumption were absolute and unforgiving. Yet today, something was different. Strapped beneath each wing of Hartwell's fighter were two teardrop-shaped metal tanks, ugly protrusions that disrupted the Mustang's sleek lines and added drag that made the aircraft feel sluggish and unresponsive. These experimental drop tanks, filled with an additional 110 gallons of fuel, represented either the solution to the 8th Air Force's most critical problem, or an expensive waste of resources that would get pilots killed. Hartwell was about to find out which. The strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany had reached a crisis point by early 1944, and the problem was devastatingly simple. American B-17 and B-24 bombers could reach targets deep inside Germany, but their fighter escorts could not. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary escort fighter through 1943, had an operational radius of roughly 230 miles. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning could push to around 340 miles under optimal conditions. Beyond these ranges, the bombers flew unescorted into airspace patrolled by hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters specifically designed to destroy heavy bombers. The results were catastrophic and unsustainable. The Schweinfurt raids of August and October 1943 had demonstrated the problem with brutal clarity. On August 17, 1943, 376 B-17s attacked ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and Regensburg, without fighter escort for the deepest portions of their mission. 60 bombers failed to return, with another 100 damaged. The October 14 mission proved even worse. 291 B-17s attacked Schweinfurt again, and this time 77 bombers were shot down with another 122 damaged, some so severely they never flew again. The 8th Air Force lost 650 airmen killed or captured in a single afternoon. Bomber crews began referring to such missions as suicide runs, and morale plummeted as men calculated their odds of surviving a standard 25-mission combat tour. The mathematics suggested most would not. General Henry Arnold, commanding the United States Army Air Forces, faced an impossible dilemma. The strategic bombing campaign represented America's primary contribution to defeating Germany before the planned invasion of France. Destroying German industry, oil production and transportation networks was essential to weakening the Nazi war machine. However, continuing deep penetration raids without adequate fighter escort would bleed the bomber force dry faster than replacement, and crews could arrive from training facilities in the United States. Something had to change, and it had to change quickly. The answer emerged from an unlikely combination of British engineering, American industrial capacity, and combat-proven that had initially been rejected by the U.S. Army Air Corps. The North American P-51 Mustang had entered service with the Royal Air Force in 1942, powered by the American Allison engine. RAF pilots praised the aircraft's handling characteristics, exceptional range and stability, but criticized its high-altitude performance. The Allison engine, designed for low and medium altitudes, lost power dramatically above 15,000 feet precisely where bomber escort missions were fought. North American aviation engineers, working with British counterparts, married the Mustang airframe to the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove the legendary Supermarine Spitfire. The transformation was revolutionary. The P-51B variant, equipped with the American-built Packard Merlin engine, could reach speeds exceeding 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, climb rapidly, turn tightly, and most critically, fly farther than any other fighter in operational service. The Mustang's internal fuel capacity of 269 gallons gave it an operational radius of approximately 475 miles under normal conditions. This represented a significant improvement over the P-47 and P-38, but still fell short of what was needed to escort bombers to targets like Berlin, which lay nearly 600 miles from bases in England. The solution existed in theory. External drop tanks, jettisonable fuel containers that could be released when empty, or when combat required maximum maneuverability, could extend the Mustang's range indefinitely. In practice, however, the engineering challenges were substantial. The tanks had to be manufactured quickly and cheaply, needed to feed fuel reliably at high altitudes and varying temperatures, could not create excessive drag that would slow the fighter or increase fuel consumption, and had to release cleanly without damaging the air. Multiple designs emerged from American and British manufacturers through late 1943, and pressed paper tanks made from laminated cardboard and resin were lightweight and inexpensive, but proved unreliable in combat conditions. Metal tanks were durable but heavy and expensive to manufacture. Composite designs attempted to balance these factors with mixed results. The ferrying tanks used to transport fighters across the Atlantic were far too large and created unacceptable drag for combat operations. Test pilots reported various problems including fuel flow issues at altitude, tanks that refused to release, tanks that released prematurely, and aerodynamic characteristics that made the aircraft difficult to control. Each problem required engineering solutions, testing, and refinement, all while the bomber offensive continued to suffer unsustainable losses. Benjamin Hartwell had joined the 354th Fighter Group in November 1943, when the unit arrived in England, equipped with the new P-51B Mustangs. The 24-year-old pilot from Portland, Oregon, had completed flight training at Thunderbird Field, where instructors had quickly identified his natural aptitude for precision flying and aerial gunnery. His training record showed consistently high scores in navigation, a critical skill for escort missions that required fighters to rendezvous with bomber formations at specific coordinates and maintain position during hours-long missions over enemy territory. Hartwell's methodical temperament and mechanical aptitude made him an obvious choice when group commanders needed pilots to test the experimental drop tank systems. The assignment came with risks. Untested equipment failed unpredictably, and failed fuel systems over Germany meant forced landings in enemy territory if the pilots survived long enough to reach the ground. The mission on March 4, 1944, had been planned as a maximum range test of the drop tank system. Hartwell's flight of 4 P-51Es would escort a bomber formation attacking factories near Brunswick, approximately 380 miles from their base at Boxted in Essex. The mission profile required the Mustangs to cruise at specified power settings, monitoring fuel consumption from both internal tanks and the external drops. Pilots would record exact fuel levels at 15-minute intervals, noting any anomalies in flow, pressure, or handling characteristics meant. That's what for artwords, that's what for sticks to pretty fos, but for the fos, that's what for sticks to vitzes, pretty fos, but for the fos, but for the. If everything functioned as designed, the fighters would have sufficient fuel to escort the bombers to the target, provide cover during the bomb run, and return to England with acceptable reserves. The engineers were confident. Hartwell was skeptical. Too many variables existed. Too many things that could fail at altitude in sub-zero temperatures while German fighters tried to kill you. The morning briefing had been straightforward. Weather over Germany was forecast as scattered clouds with good visibility. German fighter opposition was expected to be heavy, particularly during the bomb run and withdrawal. Intelligence reported that Luftwaffe units had been reinforced along the approaches to Brunswick, specifically to counter the increasing American daylight raids.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The bomber force consisted of 173 B-17-7s from multiple groups carrying a mixed payload of high explosive and incendiary bombs. Hartwell's flight would rendezvous with the bomber stream over the North Sea and maintain position through the target area. The mission was expected to last approximately 4.5 hours from takeoff to landing. The P-51s would be operating at the absolute edge of their extended range with no margin for error and no reserves for extended combat. Takeoff from Boxted occurred at 07:15 hours under overcast skies, typical of English winter mornings. Hartwell's Mustang, coded AJW and named Oregon Express after his home state, struggled into the air with the additional weight of the drop tanks. The aircraft felt heavy and unresponsive during the climb, and Hartwell had to consciously adjust his flying technique to compensate for the altered handling characteristics. The external tanks created noticeable drag, reducing climb rate and requiring higher power settings than normal operations. Fuel consumption during the climb was higher than calculated, an immediate concern that Hartwell noted in his kneeboard log. If consumption remained elevated, the entire mission profile would need adjustment or they would run dry before reaching friendly territory on the return leg. The four-ship formation joined up over the English coast and turned east, climbing steadily toward their assigned altitude of 25,000 feet. Hartwell flew as flight leader with Second Lieutenant Robert Chen on his wing. The second element consisted of First Lieutenant Marcus DeLuca and Second Lieutenant James Kowalski. All four pilots were experienced, having flown multiple escort missions over France and the Low Countries, but none had attempted a penetration this deep into Germany. The psychological weight of that reality settled over the formation as the English coastline disappeared behind them and gray water stretched ahead to the horizon. Turning back was no longer an option. The mission was committed. Rendezvous with the bomber formation occurred on schedule over the Frisian Islands at 0840 hours. The B-17-7 flew in tight combat box formations, their olive-drab fuselages and silver wings catching the morning sun. Hartwell could see the waist gunners scanning the sky through open hatches, their breath visible in the frigid air. The bombers maintained steady course and altitude, presenting a reassuring picture of disciplined formation flying. The fighter pilots knew that discipline would be tested severely once German fighters engaged. Bomber formations that lost cohesion became vulnerable to concentrated attacks. The escort fighters' primary mission was to keep the bombers together by disrupting German attack formations before they could press home their runs. It was a mission that required patience, alertness, and perfect fuel management. The first hour over enemy territory passed without incident. Hartwell's formation weaved above and behind the bombers, maintaining visual contact while conserving fuel through efficient cruise settings. The drop tanks fed smoothly and fuel gauges showed consumption tracking close to predicted levels. Hartwell began to relax slightly, thinking that perhaps the engineers had finally solved the technical problems that had plagued earlier tests. The Mustangs handled reasonably well despite the external tanks, and the mission was proceeding according to plan. Then the fuel pressure warning light for his left drop tank illuminated, indicating a feed problem that could leave half his external fuel unusable. Hartwell immediately began troubleshooting procedures, adjusting fuel selectors and checking gauge readings while maintaining formation position and visual scan for enemy aircraft. Flying combat over Germany left no room for single-task focus. Everything happened simultaneously, demanding constant attention to multiple critical factors. The left drop tank pressure recovered after Hartwell recycled the fuel selector valve twice, suggesting a temporary blockage or vapor lock that had cleared. The incident consumed 5 minutes of intense concentration and demonstrated how quickly equipment failures could cascade into mission-ending emergencies. If the tank had remained unusable, Hartwell would have faced an immediate choice: abort and return alone to England, or continue the mission with insufficient fuel for the return leg. Neither option was acceptable. Aborting meant leaving his flight undermanned and potentially exposing bombers to attacks they might otherwise have prevented. Continuing meant almost certain bailout over enemy territory or a forced landing somewhere in Europe, assuming he survived that long. The drop tanks were supposed to eliminate these impossible choices, but the technology remained imperfect and temperamental. German fighters appeared at 0950 hours, exactly when intelligence had predicted they would. Hartwell spotted them first, small dark specks against high clouds to the north, climbing toward intercept positions. He counted at least 20 aircraft in multiple formations, probably Focke-Wulf B-190S and Messerschmitt Bf-109S from the shapes and flight characteristics. The Germans had learned through hard experience to concentrate their forces, using overwhelming numbers at single points rather than dispersing into individual attacks that accomplished little against determined fighter escorts. Hartwell keyed his radio and called out the threat vector and altitude, watching as the distant specks resolved into recognizable aircraft profiles. The German fighters continued climbing, positioning for diving attacks from above that would give them speed advantage and tactical initiative. The mathematics of aerial combat favored the attacker diving from altitude. The defender had to react, always a fraction behind, always burning more fuel to counter threats. The first German attack developed quickly as 4 Fo-190s rolled into steep dives toward the bomber formation. Hartwell pushed his throttle forward and turned toward the threat, climbing to intercept the German fighters before they could reach firing range on the bombers. His wingman Chen stayed with him, both Mustangs accelerating and climbing while the rest of the flight maintained position with the bombers. The Fo-190s were committed to their attack run and did not deviate as the P-51s closed from their flank. Hartwell achieved firing position on the trailing German fighter at 400 yards, leading the target carefully and pressing the trigger. His 650 caliber machine guns hammered, vibration shaking the airframe as tracers arced toward the enemy. Sear. Hits sparkled along the WWII-190's wing root and fuselage. The German pilot broke hard right, trailing smoke, his attack run aborted. Hartwell did not pursue. His mission was to protect the bombers, not chase individual victories. He reversed his turn and climbed back toward the formation, checking his fuel gauges automatically. The combat maneuvering had consumed fuel at triple the normal cruise rate, eating into reserves that could not be replaced. The pattern repeated throughout the next hour. German fighters attacked in waves, probing the escort screen, attempting to draw defenders out of position. Hartwell's flight intercepted multiple attack runs, forcing German pilots to break off or engage in running dogfights that pulled them away from the bombers. Several P-51s from other escort flights chased individual German fighters too far from the formation, exactly what the Luftwaffe wanted. Scattered defenders were ineffective defenders. Hartwell maintained discipline, repeatedly ordering his pilots to break off pursuit and return to position. The standing orders were clear: stay with the bombers unless directly engaged. Individual aerial victories were meaningless if the bombers they were supposed to protect went down in flames. The mission was escort, not fighter sweep, and success was measured by bombers that reached their targets and returned safely. Brunswick appeared through broken clouds ahead, identifiable by the distinctive bend in the Oker River and the geometric patterns of industrial facilities surrounding the city. Anti-aircraft fire began immediately, black puffs of exploding 88mm shells blooming around the bomber formation in deadly clouds. The B-17s flew through the flak field without deviation, bomb bay doors opening in sequence as bombardiers began their final runs. Hartwell's formation circled at higher altitude, watching for German fighters attempting to exploit the bombers' vulnerability during these critical moments when they could not maneuver. The lead bombers released their ordnance, high-explosive bombs tumbling toward factories below. Secondary explosions erupted across the target area as subsequent waves added their loads. The raid was achieving its objective, but the cost would be calculated later when aircraft failed to return and empty bunks marked those who would not come home. The withdrawal from the target area brought renewed German attacks, more aggressive and coordinated than before. The Luftwaffe knew the American fighters were operating at extreme range and would be critically low on fuel. German controllers were directing their fighters to press attacks longer, forcing the escorts to burn fuel in defensive maneuvering. It was sound tactics based on accurate intelligence about American fighter limitations. What the Germans did not fully understand yet was how the drop tanks were changing those calculations. Hartwell's flight still had usable fuel in their external tanks, extending their effective combat radius beyond anything the Luftwaffe had encountered previously. When German fighters expected the American escorts to break off and head for England, the Mustangs remained in position, still capable of sustained combat operations. Hartwell's fuel management discipline proved critical as the mission entered its fourth hour. His internal tanks showed dangerously low levels, but the drop tanks still contained usable fuel that could be fed into the main system. The other pilots in his flight reported similar status, all of them operating at the ragged edge of their fuel reserves but still mission capable. The decision point approached rapidly. Standard procedure called for dropping the external tanks once empty to reduce drag and improve performance. However, Hartwell's tanks were not yet empty, and dropping them prematurely meant abandoning fuel that might make the difference between reaching England or ditching in the North Sea. He made the decision to hold the tanks until absolutely necessary, accepting the handling penalties in exchange for maximum possible range. It was a calculated risk that could go catastrophically wrong if combat forced high fuel consumption maneuvers. The German attacks finally slackened as the bomber formation crossed back into friendly airspace over the Netherlands. The Luftwaffe fighters broke off and turned back toward Germany, unwilling to venture too far into areas where they would face overwhelming Allied fighter strength. Hartwell counted the bombers he could see, mentally noting gaps in the formation where aircraft had gone down. The losses appeared moderate compared to earlier missions, perhaps 8 or 9 aircraft missing from the formation he could observe. The improved fighter escort was making a measurable difference, reducing bomber losses to levels that were still terrible but at least sustainable. If the drop tank technology could be proven reliable and produced in sufficient quantity, the entire character of the air war over Germany would change. The Luftwaffe would no longer have sanctuary in the deep interior of the Reich. The flight back to England tested every pilot's navigation skills and nerve. Fuel gauges steadily dropped toward empty as the gray waters of the North Sea passed beneath. Hartwell's left drop tank finally ran dry at approximately 120 miles from the English coast. He activated the release mechanism and felt the tank separate cleanly falling away toward the water below. The Mustang's handling immediately improved with the reduced drag, but fuel consumption from the remaining systems increased slightly as the engine worked harder to maintain cruise speed. His calculations showed he would reach England with minimal reserves, probably less than 10 gallons in the main tank. That would be enough if nothing went wrong. If he encountered headwinds, if he could not find his home field immediately, if any of a dozen variables shifted against him, he would run out of fuel short of landing. The English coast appeared as a dark line on the horizon at 12:40 hours, nearly 5.5 hours after takeoff. Hartwell had been airborne longer than any previous combat mission, operating at the absolute limits of the P-51's extended range. His 3 wingmen were in similar situations, all of them critically low on fuel and committed to landing at the first available
airfield.
Hartwell identified Boxted through a gap in the clouds and called the tower, declaring minimum fuel emergency. The tower controller cleared all traffic and gave him straight-in approach clearance. The other 3 aircraft in his flight would land immediately behind him in trail formation. There was no fuel remaining for standard traffic patterns or go-arounds if the approach went wrong. They would land or crash trying. Oregon Express touched down on Boxted's runway at 12:53 hours with the fuel gauge reading empty. Hartwell taxied clear and shut down the engine, which coughed twice before going silent. Ground crews immediately began refueling procedures while engineering officers approached with clipboards full of questions about the drop tank performance. Hartwell climbed stiffly from the cockpit, legs cramping after nearly 6 hours strapped into the fighter's confined space. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cold, and his hands shook slightly from accumulated tension and physical exhaustion. The mission had been successful. The bombers had reached their target, the drop tanks had functioned adequately despite problems, and all 4 fighters in his flight had returned safely. The data recorded during the mission would prove invaluable for refining the system and clearing it for operational use across the entire fighter command. The engineering debriefing lasted 2 hours as Hartwell and his pilots recounted every detail of the fuel system performance. The feed problem with Hartwell's left tank was noted for further investigation. Overall consumption figures were analyzed against predicted models, showing close correlation that validated the basic engineering assumptions. The handling characteristics with tanks attached were discussed extensively, with all pilots agreeing that the degraded performance was acceptable given the range extension benefits. The psychological factor of operating at extreme range, knowing that mechanical failure or combat damage could leave you short of fuel over enemy territory, was harder to quantify but clearly significant. Fighter pilots needed absolute confidence in their worker-stiffened systems. Any doubt about fuel availability would compromise mission effectiveness and potentially lead to premature withdrawals that left bombers exposed. Group Commander Colonel Harrison Bridges reviewed the mission results that evening with evident satisfaction. The test had demonstrated conclusively that P-51 Mustangs equipped with drop tanks could escort bombers to targets throughout Germany, including Berlin itself. The strategic implications were enormous. The Luftwaffe would no longer have safe zones where they could concentrate forces without facing American fighter pilots would have to engage American escorts throughout their missions, burning fuel and wearing down their own forces through constant combat. The bomber offensive could continue with acceptable loss rates, maintaining pressure on German industry and oil production. The tide of the air war was shifting, and the humble drop tank was the technology that made it possible. Production orders for drop tanks increased dramatically following successful operational tests throughout March 1944. American factories began mass-producing the standardized design that had proven most reliable, eventually manufacturing hundreds of thousands of tanks in various capacities. British manufacturers contributed additional production, and forward supply depots in England stockpiled tanks for distribution to fighter groups. The logistics of storing, transporting, and installing thousands of disposable fuel tanks added complexity to ground operations, but the tactical benefits justified the additional effort. By April 1944, every P-51 group in England had access to drop tanks in sufficient quantity to equip full-strength missions. The operational restrictions that had limited fighter escort range for 2 years of combat operations were finally lifted. The first full-scale test of the new capability came on March 6, 1944, when 662 heavy bombers attacked targets in Berlin, escorted all the way to the Tarscheret and backed by P-51 Mustangs carrying drop tanks. The mission marked the first time American fighters had reached the German capital in force. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Luftwaffe pilots who had operated with relative impunity over Berlin suddenly faced aggressive American fighters throughout their intercepts. German civilians who had been told that Berlin was beyond range of American daylight attacks watched vapor trails from massive air battles directly overhead. Allied bomber crews who had faced the prospect of unescorted runs deep into Germany now had fighter protection all the way to target and back. The balance of power in the air war had shifted decisively. Benjamin Hartwell flew that historic Berlin mission, leading his flight through 5 hours of combat operations that pushed both men and machines to their absolute limits. The mission encountered heavy opposition, with Luftwaffe fighters staging from multiple airfields around Berlin. The air battles were intense and widespread, with hundreds of aircraft engaged simultaneously across dozens of miles. Hartwell's flight intercepted multiple attack runs on the bombers, achieving several victories while preventing numerous others through aggressive positioning that forced German pilots to break off their approaches. The drop tanks functioned reliably throughout the mission, though several pilots reported minor feed issues that required attention. More importantly, every fighter that started the mission returned to England, demonstrating that the extended-range tactics were operationally sustainable. The weeks following the Berlin raid saw a systematic expansion of long-range escort missions to targets throughout Germany. Fighter groups refined their tactics based on operational experience, developing standardized procedures for drop tank management, fuel conservation techniques, and combat protocols at extreme range. Pilots learned to fight effectively while managing fuel with precision that left no margin for error. The mental discipline required to simultaneously engage in combat maneuvering while calculating fuel consumption and navigation requirements separated effective long-range escort pilots from those who could not adapt to the demanding mission profile. Hartwell proved exceptionally capable at this multidimensional combat environment, earning him promotion to squadron operations officer, where he could train other pilots in the techniques he had developed through hard experience. The Luftwaffe adapted to the new reality with typical German tactical competence, but their adaptations could not overcome the fundamental strategic problem. American fighters now roamed freely throughout German airspace, forcing Luftwaffe units to engage on American terms or concede air superiority completely. German fighter pilots faced impossible choices: engage the escorts and burn fuel-fighting Mustangs that could stay with them anywhere over Germany, or ignore the escorts and face attacks while attempting to reach the bombers. Either way, the tactical advantage had shifted to the Americans. The drop tanks, combined with the P-51's performance characteristics and growing numerical superiority, created conditions where German fighter force attrition exceeded replacement capacity. The outcome was mathematically inevitable, though the fighting remained bitter through the spring and summer of 1940. Individual missions continued to exact brutal costs despite the improved tactical situation. The Luftwaffe fought with desperate skill, and German pilots scored victories against the American escorts through experience and determination that partially offset American numerical advantages. Hartwell witnessed friends shot down, men who had survived dozens of missions suddenly gone in seconds of savage combat. The randomness of survival troubled him during quiet moments between missions. Skill mattered, experience counted, but luck ultimately determined who flew home and who did not. The drop tanks extended range but provided no protection against it. They were simply metal shells filled with flammable liquid, and hits in the wrong place could transform them into bombs that destroyed the aircraft carrying them. Several fighters were lost when combat damage detonated their drop tanks. The pilots killed instantly in mid-air explosions that left only scattered debris falling toward the earth below. By May 1944, the strategic bombing campaign had achieved air superiority over Germany through sustained operations that the drop tanks made possible. The Luftwaffe still contested the skies, but their effectiveness had been reduced to the point where bomber losses declined to sustainable levels even during missions to the most heavily defended targets. The mathematical calculation that had made deep penetration raids prohibitively expensive in 1943 had reversed. American bomber and fighter production now exceeded losses by comfortable margins, allowing the 8th Air Force to increase mission sizes and frequency. German aircraft production, despite impressive output given the circumstances, could not replace losses while simultaneously contending with Allied bombing of factories, oil facilities, and transportation networks. The air war had become a war of attrition that Germany could not win. Benjamin Hartwell completed his combat tour of missions in July 1944 with 9 confirmed aerial victories and numerous probable kills that could not be verified through gun camera footage or witness statements. More significantly, he had flown over 40 long-range escort missions, protecting bombers during their most vulnerable moments over German territory. The bombers he helped protect delivered thousands of tons of ordnance to targets that degraded Germany's war-making capacity. The strategic impact of successful escort missions far exceeded the tactical value of individual aerial victories, though the latter received more attention in press accounts and popular imagination. Hartwell understood this distinction and took quiet pride in mission success rather than personal kill totals. He had done what was asked, mastered his aircraft and tactics, and brought most of his pilots home alive. In the brutal calculus of air combat that constituted success, the drop tank technology that enabled the long-range escort missions represented a perfect example of how incremental innovation could achieve strategic effects. The tanks themselves were simple, inelegant devices that added no glamour to the sleek Mustang fighters. They were manufactured from common materials using standard production techniques. Their engineering was straightforward, requiring no exotic alloys or revolutionary concepts, yet their impact on the air war was fundamental and decisive. By extending fighter range to match bomber requirements, drop tanks eliminated the tactical advantage that had protected German fighter forces for 2 years. The Luftwaffe could no longer attack bomber formations at will during portions of missions where escorts could not reach. Every mile of flight over Germany now occurred under potential fighter protection, fundamentally changing the combat environment and enabling the sustained offensive that ultimately destroyed German air power. The transformation of American fighter tactics through spring 1944 created ripple effects that extended far beyond individual missions. Intelligence officers at 8th Air Force Headquarters tracked Luftwaffe response patterns with meticulous attention, noting how German fighter deployments shifted in reaction to the extended escort range. Previously, German controllers had positioned fighter concentrations along predictable intercept zones where they knew American escorts would turn back due to fuel limitations. These defensive lines had been carefully calculated based on maximum P-47 and P-38 ranges, creating safe zones where German fighters could mass without facing overwhelming opposition. The appearance of P-51s carrying drop tanks shattered these assumptions within weeks. Major Gerald Thompson led the intelligence analysis team responsible for correlating mission reports, gun camera footage, and decoded German radio intercepts. His team occupied a converted manor house in Buckinghamshire, where they worked around the clock processing information from dozens of daily combat missions. Thompson had served as a fighter pilot in the previous war and understood aerial tactics from practical experience. He recognized immediately that the drop tank technology represented more than simple range extension. It fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of air combat over Europe. Thompson's analysis revealed patterns in German fighter losses that validated the escort strategy. Luftwaffe attrition rates had increased substantially since March when long-range escort missions began. German pilots were engaging in more combat per mission because they could not avoid American fighters by attacking during unescorted portions of bomber routes. Each engagement consumed fuel and ammunition while exposing pilots to combat throughout their missions rather than during brief intercept windows. The cumulative effect was wearing down German fighter strength faster than training programs could replace losses. The psychological dimension of the extended escort missions affected both sides profoundly but in opposite directions. American bomber crews who had previously faced the certainty of flying unescorted over Germany now saw friendly fighters accompanying them throughout their missions. The presence of P-51s overhead provided tangible reassurance that someone was watching out for them, intercepting German attacks before they could develop into coordinated assault runs. Bomber gunners reported that German fighters seemed less aggressive, more cautious in their approaches, frequently breaking off attacks earlier than in previous months. German fighter pilots experienced the inverse psychological pressure as their tactical situation deteriorated. Unteroffizier Klaus Zimmermann, a Bf-109 pilot with Jagdgeschwader 27, recorded his impressions in a diary that was later captured and translated by Allied intelligence. His entries from April and May 1944 documented growing frustration and fear as American escorts appeared with increasing frequency during what had previously been safe intercept opportunities. Zimmermann wrote about watching entire formations turn back from attacks when they spotted P-51s climbing toward them. His final entry, dated May 23, noted with bitter resignation that the Americans now owned the sky over Germany. Benjamin Hartwell's role evolved from line pilot to tactical instructor as his experience with long-range escort missions accumulated. Squadron commanders recognized that his methodical approach to fuel management and combat decision-making represented exactly the skill set needed for the demanding mission profile. Hartwell began conducting formal briefings for newly arrived pilots, walking them through the mental calculations required to fight effectively while operating at extreme range. He emphasized that long-range escort was fundamentally different from the fighter sweeps and short-range missions that dominated training back in the United States. The training sessions Hartwell conducted covered technical details that seemed mundane but proved critical in actual operations. He taught pilots how to read fuel gauges accurately despite the notoriously unreliable instruments installed in early P-51B models. He demonstrated proper fuel management sequences, explaining when to switch between internal tanks and drop tanks to maintain proper aircraft trim and ensure complete fuel usage. He discussed the mathematics of fuel consumption at different altitudes and power settings, helping pilots develop intuitive understanding of their aircraft's endurance envelope. Lieutenant Raymond Foster represented the type of pilot who struggled with long-range escort missions despite excellent flying skills and aggressive temperament. Foster had arrived at the squadron in April 1944 with outstanding training records and natural talent for aerobatics and gunnery. In combat, however, he repeatedly made fuel management errors that endangered himself and his wingmen. On one mission, Foster engaged in an extended dogfight with a German fighter, chasing the enemy aircraft far from the bomber formation and burning fuel at combat power settings for nearly 10 minutes. Foster's response to debriefing revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that affected some fighter pilots. He argued that his job was to shoot down German fighters and that he had accomplished that mission. Hartwell patiently explained that shooting down German fighters was a means to an end, not the end itself. The mission objective was to protect bombers so they could destroy their targets. If German fighters broke through the escort screen because individual P-51 pilots chased personal victories instead of maintaining position, then the mission had failed regardless of how many individual kills were scored. The refinement of long-range escort tactics continued through May and June as operational experience accumulated. Fighter groups developed standardized procedures for different phases of escort missions, creating doctrine that could be taught to new pilots and executed consistently across units. The pre-mission planning process became increasingly sophisticated, with detailed fuel consumption calculations based on predicted weather, altitude profiles, and expected combat intensity. Intelligence officers provided estimates of likely German fighter strength and interception points, allowing escort planners to position flights optimally. Captain Vincent Martinez commanded a flight in the 357th Fighter Group and became one of the leading proponents of aggressive long-range escort tactics. Martinez believed that the best defense for the bombers was offensive action against German fighters, forcing the Luftwaffe to fight at disadvantage rather than waiting to react to their attacks. He led his flights on climbing patrol patterns that positioned them above and ahead of the bomber formations, giving them altitude advantage and allowing them to dive on German fighters before they could organize coordinated attacks. The results validated Martinez's approach. His flight consistently achieved high interception rates, breaking up German attack formations before they could threaten the bombers. His pilots developed reputations as aggressive and skilled, achieving aerial victory totals that ranked among the highest in the 8th Air Force. More importantly, bomber formations escorted by Martinez's flights suffered lower loss rates than average, the ultimate measure of escort effectiveness. Other squadron commanders studied Martinez's tactics and adapted them to their own operations. The logistics of drop tank operations grew to massive scale as the bomber offensive intensified through spring 1944. Supply officers faced the challenge of distributing thousands of tanks to dozens of fighter groups while maintaining adequate reserves for sustained operations. The tanks themselves were bulky and awkward to transport, requiring specialized handling procedures to prevent damage. Storage facilities at forward bases needed protection from weather and potential enemy action. Installation procedures had to be streamlined to allow ground crews to attach tanks to fighters quickly during the compressed timelines of mission preparation. Master Sergeant Carl Henriksen supervised drop tank operations for the 354th Fighter Group, managing the flow of tanks from supply depots to the flight line. His team of mechanics worked through nights before major missions, installing tanks on dozens of fighters while simultaneously performing routine maintenance and repairs. Henriksen developed improved installation techniques that reduced attachment time from 20 minutes to under 10, critical when missions required launching large formations on tight schedules. He implemented quality control procedures that caught defective tanks before they were installed, preventing failures that could endanger pilots. The evolution of drop tank technology continued even as existing designs entered mass production. Engineers worked on improved models with better aerodynamic characteristics, reduced drag penalties, and more reliable fuel feed systems. Experimental designs tested alternative materials and construction methods, seeking optimal balance between cost, weight, and performance. Some innovations proved successful and were incorporated into production tanks. Others failed testing and were abandoned. The development process illustrated how wartime technological advancement occurred through iterative refinement rather than revolutionary breakthroughs. The June 1944 invasion of Normandy represented the culmination of strategic efforts that the long-range escort missions had enabled. The invasion required absolute air superiority over the landing beaches and surrounding areas. Achieving that superiority depended on degrading German fighter strength through sustained operations that destroyed areas. Culled experienced pilots and forced the Luftwaffe into defensive posture. The bomber offensive protected by long-range fighter escorts had accomplished exactly that objective. German fighter units that might have contested the Normandy beaches were instead committed to defending the Reich against daylight bombing raids. Benjamin Hartwell flew cover missions over Normandy during the first weeks of the invasion, his squadron reassigned temporarily to support ground operations. The missions were vastly different from the long-range escort work he had specialized in. Lower-altitude operations focused on attacking German ground forces and preventing Luftwaffe interference with Allied troops. The German air opposition proved minimal, scattered aircraft that appeared briefly before being driven off by overwhelming Allied fighter strength. Hartwell found the missions almost anticlimactic after months of intense air combat over Germany. The statistical analysis of the bomber offensive revealed the decisive role that long-range escort missions played in achieving strategic objectives. Between March and June 1944, when P-51 South drop tanks began escorting bombers throughout Germany, bomber loss rates declined from an average of 8% per mission to under 4%. The reduction represented thousands of aircrew lives saved and hundreds of bombers that survived to fly additional missions. Simultaneously, the tonnage of bombs delivered to German targets increased dramatically as missions could be flown with larger formations at higher frequency. The Luftwaffe's decline was equally measurable and directly attributable to the sustained combat forced by American escort fighters. German fighter pilot losses exceeded replacement rates by substantial margins through spring and summer 1944. Experienced pilots with hundreds of combat hours were being killed faster than training programs could produce even marginally qualified replacements. The average skill level of Luftwaffe fighter units declined precipitously as veterans died and novices took their places. German fighter production actually increased during this period through dispersed manufacturing, but aircraft without skilled pilots provided no tactical benefit. Individual stories from the long-range escort missions illustrated both the tactical evolution and human cost of the air campaign. First Lieutenant Daniel Reeves flew his final mission on May 11, 1944, escorting bombers to Magdeburg. His P-51 was hit by anti-aircraft fire during a low-altitude pass defending bombers from German fighters. The flak shell destroyed his right wing root, and the Mustang rolled inverted and began disintegrating. Reeves attempted to bail out but was likely killed by the initial impact or during the subsequent crash. His body was never recovered. Captain Sarah Chen, sister of Robert Chen, who flew as Hartwell's wingman, served as an intelligence officer analyzing gun camera footage and combat reports. Her work contributed directly to the tactical refinements that improved escort effectiveness and reduced casualties. Sarah spent countless hours reviewing grainy footage of aerial combat, identifying German tactics and American responses, cataloging successes and failures. Her analyses informed the training briefings that pilots like Hartwell delivered to new arrivals. The intelligence officer's contributions were as vital as the pilot's combat skills. The psychological burden of sustained combat operations affected pilots differently based on temperament and experience. Some men thrived on the adrenaline and excitement of aerial combat, counting missions eagerly as they accumulated toward completion of their tours. Others struggled with mounting stress that manifested in nightmares, anxiety, and deteriorating performance. Flight surgeons monitored pilots for signs of combat fatigue, pulling them from operations when necessary to prevent breakdowns that endangered entire formations. The line between courage and recklessness was often difficult to identify until a pilot made a fatal error. Major Richard Blackwood assumed command of the 354th Fighter Squadron in June 1944 following the promotion of his predecessor. Blackwood inherited a unit that had been in continuous combat operations for 7 months, flying some of the war's most demanding missions. He faced immediate challenges including pilot fatigue, aircraft maintenance problems, and pressure from higher headquarters to sustain operational tempo despite these issues. Blackwood had been a flight instructor before joining combat operations and understood the importance of realistic training and sustainable operations. The technological improvements to P-51 Mustangs continued throughout 1944, addressing problems identified through combat experience. The P-51D variant appeared in summer 1944 with a bubble canopy that provided far superior visibility compared to the framed canopy of earlier models. The improvement was immediately apparent to pilots who had struggled with blind spots during combat maneuvering. Better visibility meant earlier threat detection, more effective defensive reactions, and reduced vulnerability to attacks from blind quarters. The D model also incorporated 650 caliber machine guns with increased ammunition capacity. The drop tanks themselves underwent continuous improvement based on operational feedback. Later production tanks featured improved fuel feed mechanisms that reduced failure rates to negligible levels. Aerodynamic refinements decreased drag penalties, allowing fighters to fly slightly faster or farther on the same fuel load. Manufacturing quality improved as production facilities refined their processes and quality control procedures. By late 1944, drop tank reliability was so high that pilots rarely experienced significant problems during missions. The technology had evolved from experimental to routine. Benjamin Hartwell completed his combat tour in July 1944 and returned to the United States for a mandatory rest period. He had flown 53 combat missions, achieved 9 confirmed aerial victories, and participated in some of the most significant operations of the air war over Europe. His experience made him valuable as an instructor, and he was assigned to advanced flying school where new fighter pilots received their final preparation before deployment overseas. Hartwell brought combat-proven knowledge to his instruction, teaching tactics that had been developed through hard experience over German skies. The strategic impact of long-range fighter escort extended beyond the immediate tactical results of individual missions. The sustained bombing campaign protected by P-51s destroyed German industrial capacity that could not be replaced despite desperate efforts. Oil refineries bombed repeatedly never recovered full production capacity, creating fuel shortages that paralyzed German military operations across all theaters. Transportation networks disrupted by precision bombing could not maintain the flow of materials and supplies that modern military operations required. Aircraft factories damaged or destroyed reduced German production at the same time American factories accelerated output. The cost of achieving air superiority remained sobering despite the tactical success of long-range escort operations. The 8th Air Force lost approximately 47,000 aircrew killed or captured during the war, with additional thousands wounded. Fighter pilots accounted for a substantial portion of these casualties, with entire squadrons effectively destroyed and rebuilt multiple times through the course of operations. The bomber crews suffered even higher percentage casualties, with many bomb groups losing more men than their authorized strength through accumulated losses and replacements. The final months of 1944 saw continued refinement of escort tactics as the air war evolved. German jet fighters appeared in small numbers, presenting new challenges that required tactical adaptation. The Messerschmitt Me 262 could outrun any Allied propeller fighter in level flight, but its operational limitations and small numbers prevented it from significantly affecting the strategic situation. American pilots developed tactics for engaging jets during their vulnerable takeoff and landing phases, neutralizing much of their speed advantage through careful positioning and timing. The legacy of the long-range escort missions extended far beyond World War II, influencing air power doctrine and fighter development for subsequent generations. The fundamental principle that fighters must be able to escort bombers throughout their missions became axiomatic in military planning. The development of jet fighters with extended range capabilities in the post-war period reflected lessons learned over years. The integration of aerial refueling technology in the 1950s represented natural evolution of the range extension concepts that drop tanks pioneered. Benjamin Hartwell returned to combat operations in early 1945, assigned to a fighter group supporting ground operations in occupied Europe. The missions were vastly different from the long-range escort work that had occupied most of his combat tour, focused on attacking German ground forces and supporting Allied advance. The Luftwaffe opposition was minimal, scattered aircraft that posed little threat. The war was clearly entering its final phase, with German military collapse accelerating as Allied forces advanced from east and west. The final accounting of the air war over Europe confirmed the decisive role that fighter escort played in achieving strategic objectives. The bomber offensive destroyed approximately 40% of German industrial capacity, severely disrupted oil production and transportation networks, and forced the diversion of massive resources to air defense that could not be used for offensive operations. The sustained bombing campaign was possible only because fighter escorts prevented unsustainable bomber losses. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks that extended its range to match bomber requirements, was the key technology that enabled the escort mission. Individual veterans of the long-range escort missions carried their experiences throughout their lives, shaped by combat in ways both obvious and subtle. Benjamin Hartwell returned to civilian life after the war, completing college and building a career in aviation manufacturing. He remained connected to the fighter pilot community, attending reunions and maintaining correspondence with men he had flown with over Europe. In rare interviews about his wartime service, he consistently emphasized that success in combat required more than individual skill or courage. The drop tanks that had enabled long-range escort missions were scrapped by the thousands after the war, metal recycled for peacetime uses. A few survived in museums displayed alongside the P-51 Mustangs they had equipped. The tanks looked crude and ungainly compared to the sleek fighter's simple metal shells that seemed unremarkable. Yet their strategic impact was profound and lasting. They represented how incremental innovation applied to defined problems could achieve decisive effects. The transformation of American fighter operations from limited-range escorts to long-range dominance occurred within less than a year, testament to American adaptability and industrial capacity. The tactical problems were engineering solutions developed, production scaled to operational requirements, and doctrine refined through combat experience, all in compressed time frame that reflected urgency of military necessity. The speed of this transformation provided stark contrast to German efforts that produced revolutionary technologies like jet fighters but could not field them in numbers or conditions that affected strategic outcomes. The story of long-range fighter escort missions represents a case study in how wars are actually won through prosaic logistics and incremental improvements rather than dramatic battles or revolutionary technologies. The drop tanks were not glamorous, the fuel management calculations were tedious, the missions were exhausting endurance tests punctuated by moments of terror. Yet this unglamorous work, performed by thousands of men over hundreds of missions, achieved strategic objectives that shortened the war and saved countless lives. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.